I want to start just by reading what I loved what it is that he wrote about what universalism is. And he says, we are called by this new faith into radical connectedness. Judgment is not a human responsibility. We need to learn that, don't we? Discrimination against any human being on the basis of that which is a given is always evil and does not serve the Christian goal of offering abundant life to all. Any structure in either the secular world or the institutional church that diminishes the humanity of any child of God on any external basis of race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation must be exposed publicly and vigorously. There can be no reason in the church of tomorrow for excusing or even forgiving discriminatory practices. Sacred tradition must never again provide a cover to justify discriminatory evil. The call to universalism must be the message of Christianity.
Amen.
Amen.
Isn't that a great statement?
Yes.
And one that's so hard to live out, because when he talks about that which is a given, there's all kinds of things that we put down as a given that maybe are not universal, but we use those to be able to, right? It can even be something as wonderful as, well, she's obviously not following a path of love as well as what I am, and so, right? And it may be true what I just said, but to then use that as a form of discrimination, as a way to divide us, push us away, push others away, that's what he's talking about. So how do you discriminate? No, I don't mean that. How is it that we stop ourselves from doing all those patterns of division? Because we all find it easy to do that.
Yeah, I just get so mad at myself sometimes because something will happen and a thought will race through my head and I'll say, oh my golly, I can't believe you thought that. You know, I'm saying to myself, and it's like, you know better, but you have learned all of these behaviors and thoughts in the past, and it's hard to dispose of them completely.
I always try to keep in mind the walk a mile in another's shoes things, because you can't, I find it difficult to develop empathy if I can't place myself in that other person's being in some way. You know, I'm driving down the road in a car and somebody cuts me off.
Yeah.
It's really difficult for me to evince a lot of empathy with.
It's really difficult for the person in the passenger seat to look.
Yeah. All right. You're right.
Yeah. But Jeff, I have that same problem, and I've decided that this is why that's true. It's because I see so well where I'm going on that road, that why is it that somebody else gets in the way of what is so clear to me that that's where I'm going, and all of a sudden they're in the way of it. And it's so clear in my own head. And I think that's the problem. There's a whole lot of stuff that's clear in our head.
Or we think is clear.
Or we think it's clear.
In
right?
fact, somebody sent me something recently that had a line in it about don't spend a day in my shoes, spend 10 minutes in my head. That'll really freak you out.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? And we just have a hard time putting that other person in there as strongly as what our own ego view is.
I remember, and I can't remember now, of course, my memory's getting shoddy. But when I saw people struggling on the streets and stuff, I used to have I used to say a little prayer for them, and I wish I could remember what it is, you know, like God grant them peace, help them, you know, it was so I just try to do in a thought pattern now, but I used to say a little thing because when I saw people struggling on the street, it made me, you know, really sad, and I wanted to do anything I could help them. And I thought, well, I'll send a positive thought towards them is what I want to do. And I used to have that saying, but my memory's going now, and it was just like a 3-liner or something, but
Mhm.
just a positive thought towards them, that because so many people pass homeless and people like that and send negative thoughts to them,
Yeah. That's a
They
really
think-
easy place to do the judgment
Yeah.
that Dr. Spong talked against,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So
I
I,
think we've been in a period right now with the pandemic and politics and so many things where it's very easy to be judgmental,
Mhm.
to fall into that because
Because they're so wrong.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And we know exactly how to solve all the problems.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I need to have something to say to myself, to wish them, they're okay. I love them, but I'm sorry they're going down the wrong path.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, but
Maybe they will see the light, but rather than a negative feeling towards them or something.
yeah, and that's really hard to do. It's the
Yeah.
same thing with homelessness. Like, I remember a presentation that someone did. I think they were from Paradise Valley Church, so relatively wealthy church in our denomination.
Oh, I
area.
used to go there.
Yep. And they were talking about their son who was on the streets,
Mhm.
right? And she had lots of resources, but she realized in the presentation, she said, I realized that was the choice he was making, was to be there.
Mhm.
And that my money was not what was going to save him from that. He had to decide. And as I worked with homeless in Yuma, I realized that for some of them, homeless on the streets felt safer or more natural to them then.
I think that's the problem there, because we have this stereotype of people who are homeless and we put them all in the same bucket. And there are so many reasons for them to be homeless.
Right.
They could have lost a job, or they could be somebody who is claustrophobic and cannot bear being inside a building,
Mhm.
or for whatever reason. But
Mhm.
we tend to put them all into the same bucket, and
Right.
we can't solve problems by putting people into buckets.
That's right. So now apply that over to politics,
Oh, yeah.
right? When someone is thinking completely different than you, it's really simple just to vilify and say, that's wrong. That has no place in political thought, right? Only my way of thinking is.
Yes.
But the reality is that it comes from some direction. And you may not understand or agree with that direction, but there's foundational elements behind it that are important. And can you open up enough to be able to hear that in the other person and invite them to do that for you? Because that's what we're really missing in our politics right now, is we're all right and we don't hear the other side right now.
Well,
when I was with my time with evangelicals, my decade with the evangelicals really did.
It sounds like a title of a book, Judy.
Yeah, really, it does, doesn't it? It could be. But I remember when I left, when I knew I had to leave there, and like, what was I searching for? And this chapter kind of defined for me what it was I was looking for. I couldn't put it in these words. But when I left there, and they would no longer have any contact with me once I left, because you can't have any contact with somebody unless they believe the same thing you do if you're an evangelical. But when I sent them a letter stating why I was leaving, the biggest thing I put in is I can't belong to a church that is judging people other people so harshly. And I keep thinking, how could I have better expressed myself? And and why I was leaving. And I wish I'd had more, but at the time, I hadn't read Spong. I hadn't read Alton McLaren. I hadn't read all these people. And I knew I wanted a more progressive Christianity, but I didn't know what that exactly meant. So it's the last few years have really opened my mind to what it is I am searching for. And it's about, I like this whole thing too, it's about love. If it's, I just keep wanting to go to the evangelicals and go, why, their emphasis is on judging people who don't believe exactly as they do, and judging whether you're gay or whether you're whatever, if you don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, you're going to hell, and all these things that just confounded me. And I just want to go, where is Jesus where Jesus isn't the focus for them? It's this judgmental God.
The hard part is, Judy, like from my background, I realized that Mormons don't see very far outside of they have a really good perspective, but they don't see very far outside of that. And so it's like blinders on a horse. And the struggle for my family has been to say, Jim's okay, even though he's outside of my typical range of vision. And can we try to help that to be true? The bad part is if I'm convinced that I'm right, it is really easy to put outside of my blinders a negative value to it. And you're right that evangelicals do that, especially if you have some sense of only certain people are saved.
And they don't even want to be exposed to anything outside of that. I mean, it's
Yep.
dangerous, even like, they didn't read, if it wasn't the Bible, they didn't read it. Or some commentary on the Bible that espoused their viewpoints, and that just was, or Fox News.
Yeah.
Which really was mind blowing.
And it becomes very limiting, doesn't it?
But it's hard because when you're in that place, you don't know what it is. I didn't have words to put in. I didn't have the words to say what the world I was searching for.
Yeah.
And I still don't in some ways, but at least I have a better understanding now of what it is I want my own, because to me, the evangelicals too, it's more about church and institution than it and
I think it helps, Judy, if you remember that evangelicals, like my Mormon background, they tend to love the people within this circle really, really well.
Oh yeah.
Right? And so they tend to build a really good community here. And so they think that finishes the need for community building because they're doing that wonderfully and well. But does it? Is that all that Christ calls us to? And maybe that's the conversation that can be had somewhere there, because that builds on a strength of theirs, that they are loving within that community.
So where does that fit in then with the story of the Good Samaritan? Because Jesus was reaching outside of his.
He was reaching outside of. One of my best things that I ever said to my mom, and that helped us to have conversation, because you have to understand the dynamic of my mom and I is I went from Mormonism to Methodism. She went from Methodism to Mormonism.
Oh.
Right. And so there's a very opposite dynamic going on there. And so she asked, well, how could I be in a church with you guys? Right. These people who accept all these things that are, in some ways anathema to who she is. Right. How can you? How do you get there? And I looked at her and I said, Mom, I stand up for people in the LGBT community because you taught me to stand up for those people when I was young. Not necessarily LGBTQ, but for my Black neighbor, for the persecuted one who is over here. You taught me to be who I am today. And I truly believe that who I am flows out of all of that. And I need her to know that I'm not working in a different world than where she's at. And I don't think, Judy, that you are working in a different world than what those evangelicals are at. But how they play it out and where they draw their lines of a limitation are very different. And can we allow the dissolution of those lines and be able to talk still?
To tell you the truth, that, you know, all of this whole study has been really not eye-opening, but sort of putting into words things that I have felt. But I have to tell you that the very last part of the New Christianity, where he talks about Matthew Fox's image of God groundwater, that spoke to me. It was like, wow, all of these different forms of water, yet it is still water, still life-giving, and it can taste different to different people. It was just amazing. That analogy was just the most wonderful analogy.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, to me too, when I would read, I just keep wanting to ask these people, have you read the Sermon on the Mount? Because to me, God's should be about love, because that to me is what, I mean, that just is the biggest commandment. That's like everything. And so all these judgments, but then they had a blind eye towards themselves. I mean, these were people who, this is a very rich congregation, you know, generally. And like, I know two of the people one was vice president of Tower Raytheon. And it's like, I just wanted to go, yeah, but you make weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, how does that fit in with the biblical view? But of course I didn't, because that was a little, even I couldn't quite go that far in confronting them. But, you know, it's just, but about all these judgments they made and stuff, I just wanted to go, where is love in all of this?
Well, and the hard part is this, Judy, there's times when judgment is love. In that if you have to draw some lines of boundary from you and another person to be able to protect a person you love, sometimes that's an appropriate thing. But we overemphasize that judgment to a very real extent. We take what little drops of judgment Jesus does, and we turn them into the whole of how we're supposed to live in the world. And it's what we emphasize very often, rather than
what I was going to say. It's more about where you focus. If your focus is on judgment instead of love, then that taints your worldview. But if your worldview is more about love, and also I wanted to learn about wisdom, all the different wisdom texts, you know, and it's like, if I wanted to look at Buddhism, they're like, oh, you're gonna worship Buddha now.
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't worship Buddha.
Yeah, but see, that's that groundwater thing again. If what I've done is I've decided that my well is the only source of fresh water in the world, only source of good water, only source of life in the world, then it's hard for me to see that there's a well just a little bit down the road that also taps into that. If you think about our Christian narrative, and I'll even toss the Judeo tradition in there, it says that God only spoke in one little tiny place in the world and nowhere else, that all the revelation of God originated from the Holy Land. And that's it. Look at how much it says the fresh water can't be found in all of these other places of the world. And what's that say about your God?
It's pretty small.
Yeah, that's a pretty small God. And so to say that maybe there's a way that people in India have been able to tap into that, and it's come out as Hinduism. If all you see as Hinduism is not an expression of God, that it's somehow evil, then you're not able to see that maybe God could speak there.
That's absolutely true. Why do we think that the creator of the universe has become so myopic and focused with the presence of God's being?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah, I think that's probably why some people hold on to the 6,000 year history of Earth,
Yeah.
because then the narrative of it all originated in Eden and God was always there and present, but we were the ones who moved to places like India and China and South America, not God. God had already spoken to us and told us how to do it. And I think that's why they hold on to those types of very small images. It contains better, controls better.
Well, and they don't have to worry about thousands of people who lived before that time who did not have access to the story of
Yeah.
God and Jesus.
Yeah.
Or the story of God in the Old Testament too is one of, I mean, I'm sorry, I look at God in the Old Testament, it's tribal. He's a mass murderer. I mean, this God in the Old Testament is not, to me, that's the God that the evangelicals were looking at, is one who is very tribal and who's really into, dividing. I mean, if you weren't a Christian or Israeli or whatever, if you were Egyptian, you were wiped out, and it's just, that's the God I think they focus on more than Jesus do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the way I understood Bishop Spong, though, was when he was talking about Trinity, and he showed the different reasons. And Trinity has never been my favorite doctrine. It's a very confusing way, but I like the way he described the different things. But then I especially liked what he said at the end. The Trinity is not a description of my God, but of my God experience. It does not mean that God is a Trinity. And if we could hold on to that type of mentality, that what I say about God, what I say about all of these things religiously, this is my experience. This is not God's self. But it's much easier to be able to say, I hold on to God, not I hold on to my vision of God.
Okay.
And I think that's more accurate, don't you?
If you think about it, even in your knowledge of people, you know someone from church, or someone from some other organization, someone in your family or your spouse's family, but you still don't know all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't speak for all of those parts of that person.
Mm-hmm.
And we can understand that with humans, but for some reason we think that we know everything about God.
Right. And isn't that the most interestingly arrogant position to take? That the one that we describe as infinite and undescribable, we put hardline descriptions on.
We know exactly what he wants us to do and not to do.
Yeah, and not she.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
All of those type of things. There's so much we put on that says
I'm too old. I have a hard time dealing with that.
Yeah.
I do like the way it's usually spoken, just using God instead of he or she, the pronoun, when writing or when speaking. And when if I were writing, I would know enough to do that. But it's difficult when you're talking. You go back to using the old forms.
Mm-hmm.
And but I like it when they'll say God in God's will rather than God in his will.
Yeah, yeah.
And I like the way that that is used because I don't think God has a gender.
Yeah. But I think that's a very, that takes intentionality and thoughtfulness
Yes.
as you're going through it. You have to decide, I'm not going to always say it just one way. I'm not going to always just do it in the easy way that slips off my tongue, the simplest. I'm going to try to be thoughtful about it. And you think about it, shouldn't we always try to be thoughtful about how we talk about God? But we love formulaic stuff,
Oh, yes.
right? And so we
It's
easily
easy.
just slip into those. Yeah, it's easy.
Formulae are easy.
Yeah.
But we need to be equally as careful as with how we talk about other people,
Yes.
because it
I
comes
did
out,
like that. Oh, go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry, honey.
just comes out kind of the same way. The worrisome thing about judgment for me is that I feel like it's contagious. If I'm in a group of people that are smacking other folks around or stuff, it just, I feel drawn to behave like that, and I don't, so I have to leave. I don't know any way to fight it other than absent myself from it,
Yeah. Yeah.
to protect myself.
Have I told you the story about working with homeless in Yuma? We're having a meeting. Have I told you this story before?
I don't
So
remember.
we're trying to figure out what is this homeless issue, right? Why is it some people are letting them into our church and inviting them and taking care of them and whatnot? So we had, so it was properly divided. Here were the pro and here were the con, right? And so one lady's talking and she says, those homeless. And then she stopped and said, I don't even know. Is that what you like to be called? And this one girl stood up and said, I like to be called Jenna. Right? And suddenly personalized it. And do we see in any kind of separation like this, do we see just the group, which with whatever pejorative we put on it, or do I see a person? Do I see a human being in the midst of it? And
Well,
then
as someone
you're off.
who feels like as someone who feels like I'm sometimes about that close to homelessness, it's like I can identify more with it than I think a lot of people can, because I can see a situation where, as someone who lives on a small teacher's pension and Social Security, and my rent was going up $100 a year, it's like I could see myself on the streets in a few years easily. So it was like, that wasn't an impossibility to me, whereas I think some people can. The other thing is, I just always, when people talk about God, I have to ask them, how do you define God? Because that's going to tell me an awful lot about whether or not I can relate to what you're saying.
Yeah.
If you personalize God and God is in your own image, then it's like that. I know kind of where I don't know. It's that whole, how I'm just always interested in how people define God, and if they even try to define God. Because to me, once you think you've defined God, you've obviously limited it.
Right. But we all have to do that. At least part of what the God experience is to try to have something, put together something that we can hold on to. That it's not just the limitless out there, but to have things that are definable for us. And it's not in those definitions that we're wrong. It's in the only.
Yeah.
Right. When we start, when people say, read the John 14 passage that he said that I am the way, the truth, and the life, they often mean I am the only way, the only truth. And define God that small into that. And can we have better conversations than our only conversations?
Quick question for you, Jim. Where does the land of Nod figure in the Old Testament?
It's been a long time since I've studied that. It's in the book of Genesis.
Okay.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's where Cain's wife comes from.
That's what I was thinking. I had just boogied out and grabbed the Bible, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
But it always intrigued me that there was all this creation going on, and God is creating the people, and these are the only ones, and so forth and so on. Then all of a sudden, Nod pops up here.
Yeah.
Where the heck do they come from?
Here's what we don't have. We think that Genesis is telling the story of the whole world. Where in reality, if you look at stories like the land of Nod, you realize that it's telling the story of a people in a certain valley. And there's a mountain here, and there's a valley on the other side, the land of Nod, or the land of whatever. But the Old Testament is just saying, no, I'm concerned with you guys. I'm concerned with the history we're making. That's kind of the way you have to see Old Testament. But instead we said, this is God doing everything with everybody, tells the whole definition of. And it's that only that I've got the whole answer that sometimes is the problem. Right? I love the story that he told of sitting with the two monks in China, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And having this exchange, and then they essentially said, well, they'd only met Christ in the hands of a conquering colonial power. That was the only way that they were able to see Christ. And I wonder how much we are showing to each other only a particularly limited way of viewing whatever. If we're only seeing Islam through some of their terrorist acts, that's a poor way to see that whole religion, a very slivered way to see it. What else are they? What else have they done? For example, on Sunday, I talked about that Dark Ages hole. You know what helped save us from the Dark Ages hole? You know who saved the wisdom of Western Europe?
Probably Islam.
It was Islam on our edges that had wonderful universities and things, and kept much of that knowledge alive for
And
us.
libraries.
And libraries that then returned it to us as we were coming out of that Dark Ages. Right? Do we thank them for that, or we see them only for the battlefields that we've often fought on?
Interesting.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books that you ought to study if you're really interested in this, is called God Is Not One. It's by a man named Stephen Prothero. And it's his whole take is that you have to, as you look at it's about the 8 world religions, the biggest world religions. It doesn't deal with all of them, but it deals with a whole bunch of them. And he basically says, what problem are they seeing? And what do they see as the solution? So for much of Christianity, the problem is sin, that we are wrong. And the solution is salvation, that Jesus brings the freedom of salvation. Islam is very different. It's willfulness, not sin, but independence. And so if you look today, what is America representing as Christianity? Independent thought. And so look how contrary that goes to submit to. That's their solution, is to submit to Allah. Submit yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't submit very much in Christianity.
It's a dirty word.
It's a dirty word, right? And much of our Christianity fights against that. Not just, but as we look in each thing, if we think like Buddhists, then the problem is suffering. Where is suffering present in me and around me? And how do I get from that to an enlightened nirvana space? Right. So how we view the problem and the solution is very different. And that's kind of the model that Stephen Prothero uses here. And so if you ever want to read an interesting book, that's a good book to look at.
Reminds me of, again, the Talmud saying, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
Mm-hmm.
And in public relations, which was my field before I retired, we would say perception is reality. So don't try to, you really have to deal with people's perceptions.
Right. And to be in that relational space enough you know, you can't change somebody unless you're in a relational space with them.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
And we often want to change them without doing that hard relational work, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
And they definitely want to change us without doing the
And that-
foundational work.
And you know what, it's appropriate that we should know that other people look at us and say there's change that needs to happen there.
Mhm.
And we fight that need to change me just as much as they fight the need to change them.
It's awfully difficult when you know everything.
It is awfully difficult. But that's why we have forever sent missionaries around the world to say, we're going to fix the whole world. We're going to make disciples of everyone and make them all think like me.
Where probably they should have taken a leaf from the book of a well-respected teacher that I knew when I was teaching, who taught me the best way to disarm parents who came in for the parent-teacher conference night. And I would begin by saying, it's nice to have you here. I'll tell you what, let's strike a little agreement. I'll believe half of what your student tells me about you if you believe half of what he tells you about me. And that way we'll make some progress.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to deal with for a little bit that continued tendency that we have. Like, I think that who St. Francis has been and how they live could change the world, could solve the world. How do we do that, market ourselves without becoming I have the only right answer over here? So to do that, let me just tell you about a particular space that I love. You guys know that I love the Refuge of Hope down in Peru. And I have some really good friends of mine that go down there on a regular basis. One of them is Paula. She comes from Lynchburg, Virginia, or somewhere in Virginia, maybe not Lynchburg, but in that area. And they come down to do a vacation Bible school every year. She doesn't speak really good Spanish, and neither do most of the kids she brings down, but they do a vacation Bible school to teach those kids the right answers. I would rather empower and send money to Pastor Victor to do a vacation Bible school, because he knows where they're at, what they've done, and yet she doesn't trust them to do that.
To do it
She
right.
thinks she has to. And it's not that she's doing this in a horrible way. She goes down and does wonderful things. Okay, so I really don't want to denigrate her, but it's the sense of I have to somehow teach them instead of I have to empower them. And we do a lot of wanting to teach each other, don't we? With good reasons, Judy. There's a lot that conservative church you were at needs to learn. But what do we do to empower them to grow into a better space rather than try to teach them the right space to grow into?
Love, listen, try to understand where they're coming from, ask questions rather than offer answers, all of which I might add would be very difficult for me and probably, most people, but I think there is a saying too, you can't, what is it? You can't argue something.
You can't argue a person out of a position that they were never argued into.
Yeah, that they were never, you can't reason someone out of a position they were never reasoned into. It's often much more about emotion.
Yeah,
than reason.
Yeah.
We need to ask people what they think they need as well, rather than, if we have resources to help someone, rather than just going in there and making the decision about what they need, we need to ask them what they need. Even in a situation of a crisis with, like a physical disaster of some sort. just going in and with all kinds of supplies and stuff, when that's not the first thing that they need, may get in the way of what really needs to happen. And so that's part of the problem. I mean, well-meaning people can be just as bad as people who, just ignore what has happened in a place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think part of what I hear you describing is what the missionary experience
yeah.
around the world has been of Christians. I think most Christians who go there have had some well-meaning to them, not all,
Oh, yes.
right? But are they busy trying to say, my groundwater is the only groundwater that's right to drink from? Stop drinking from the one that's here.
Well, I don't know whether you've read the Poisonwood Bible.
I have not, but I've heard really wonderful things about it.
Basically, and it's been a long time since I've read it, but this woman is telling the story of her father, who is a missionary who goes, and he's decided that the people there need to learn how to grow, I think it's corn. It is not, the land is not suitable for whatever it is he's decided that they need. And he's a well-meaning person, but he is so determined that this is what they need to do, rather than listening to them because they're already farmers there. And so it's an intriguing thing about how we get something in our head that somebody needs something.
Yeah. And that's not dissimilar to the story that Shushaku Endo wrote, who is a big novelist in Japan, called Silence. It was made into a movie 10 years ago or so, where Christian missionaries are going back into a space where they had been thrown out because of the damage that was happening there. And we're trying to hear once again what it is how is this land different then? And I think we've done a whole bunch of not listening to the land that we go into, right? And how they think, or especially how they think differently than we do. We put our judgments on very easily.
Boy, that's true in India, especially with regards to agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Monsanto has been carefully, patiently, and assiduously getting them to grow or to try to grow crops U.S. way, using U.S. machinery and knowledge and whatnot. And it's not working very well. And the farmers who have been told this is the way you really need to do it, both the Indian government and a number of businesses and some well-intentioned people in the United States, is causing great friction, I think, in society.
20 years ago or so, I went down to Peru for the first time. One of the guys who went with me is an amazing man. His name is Alan, and I do not mean this story to denigrate Alan at all, because he has done incredible things. He's a building inspector for the city of Phoenix, or has been. He's retired now. And so he knows how to build things. And whenever we go down there, we build things, right? We put up ceilings, or we do different things. And sometimes he's frustrated. And one time he went to Victor and he said, Victor, why have you got a supervisor for us in the morning and a supervisor in the afternoon? I can do this by myself. And he said, and Victor looked at him and says, because both those guys need jobs. Both those guys need a little bit of money for their families. Victor was looking at the situation not as a build, but as a community builder, not as a building thing. And I think that's what we have to ask, is what is it that each person is looking for? What are they emphasizing? What's important to them in this moment, in this exchange? And if we don't know that, all of our judgments are going to fall incorrectly, aren't they?
I think a lot of it's what do you look to religion for anyway?
Yeah.
What is it you're looking for in a religion? Are you looking for rituals that'll help you understand life? Are you looking to for meaning? Are you looking for all the above? Are you looking for certainty because you don't want to live in an uncertain world? Are you looking for, I mean, to me, I'm looking for the mystery of it all. You know, I'm looking at the little dark holes, the uncertainty. I'm looking for the wisdom that comes down through the ages, maybe, or something. Whereas people go into looking at religion for different reasons.
Right. But I think that's why Dr. Spong said that the nature of God is beyond my ability to describe. And we try to describe it perfectly, that God is always love, but what does love mean in this particular sense might be very different than what it might mean in a different sense. So to describe it and think we have the perfect description, that's a bit arrogant, isn't it? To have the humility to say, I can't describe it perfectly. And especially to say, and because I've described it perfectly, you have to follow exactly in my footsteps. You know? But yet that seems like much of what we do, isn't it?
Or I can't love you.
I can't love you until.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. But when I think about the word only, right, where we say the only truth, the only way, I think if you apply that to other things, what if I said, I have the only grandma? And those grandmas you have, those are not true grandmas. They don't matter. Right? And how much do we do that type of statement though? And how many of you have not just whoever your parents were, but you have other mothers and fathers that also spoke into you in wonderfully loving ways. Sometimes in those years, like in your junior high years, when you couldn't listen at all to your birth mother or father, and yet somebody else was able to be that voice for you. How do we be in that space for each other and not have to say, my grandma is the only grandma?
You mean I'm not?
The good news is that Dr. Spong has given us books and books about how to do that, right? And what we've done, as deeply as we've gone into his stuff, only begins to step into the questions that he's asking us. And I love that he freely admits that he's not going to be able to see the whole of. And he's died now, so he hasn't seen the culmination of, but he's added the stuff to us that's allowed us now to open up in ways that we haven't before. So where do we go from here? How do we continue the conversation? How do we enlarge the conversation?
I guess too, it's like sometimes I ask myself, why do I even want to go to a church? You know, it's like I could do all this on my own. And part of it is seeking a sense of community somewhere with other fellow seekers, people who don't have the answers, but are looking for the answers also, and can be in a conversation with these people about me. It's like, what can others challenge me with or help me learn about and go deeper into things that I hadn't even thought about before? And why even, like my thing with a lot of people is, why are you even Christian? If you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God and you don't believe the Bible is literal and stuff, then why are you even a Christian? And it's interesting the responses I get for that. You know, it's like, and Spong speaks to that directly, but which is good. Sometimes I don't even know if I don't know if I would even call myself a Christian, but I believe more in the teachings of Jesus than in the Bible itself.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there's just so many questions about that I have floating in my brain that this community at St. Francis spurs me into thinking more about than any other, because I don't want to be at a church that has just answers for me.
Right.
Because their answers aren't going to fit my answers. I want somebody who has more questions than they do answers.
But I think, Judy, you're exactly on the right track. Are the names, the labels we've placed, are they working any longer? Do I have to have a Christianity versus a Buddhism? Right? Do I have to see them in opposition, or can they be in conversation and even be fused in me? Right? And that can be true about any other thought. Do we have to have the hardline labels that we've often said?
I think we can say, as very much as Spong does, as far as the groundwater is concerned, that all of these religions see God from a different angle. It's sort of like a prism. If you look in, if you see a prism with all of its different angles and everything, it's all still the same prism, but you might see blue coming out of there and somebody else sees red coming out of there. That doesn't mean red is right and blue is wrong.
Right. Is blue the only color because that's the only one you see?
Yes.
Or because your whole world is tainted by blue?
Yes, and I think that what he says is that for him, Christianity is what has meaning for him, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to go. And I think I sort of feel that way too. And maybe it's just because I feel comfortable, going to, especially a Methodist church, having grown up in one. But going to church actually is a kind of discipline for me. And it's not
Yeah, I
discipline.
know listening to a certain pastor is really hard, so I understand that discipline.
No, what I mean is it's developing a discipline of study and learning. And I do love to read and to learn. And I suspect that if I were in a more evangelical church, that the study would all be one-sided and very well controlled, rather than being a sort of the free-for-all that one of the reasons I chose St. Francis for is because it is sort of a free-for-all, but still within that Methodist tradition.
Yeah, and that messiness is really hard for some people.
Yes.
And that's why they put a more ordered, structured
but
belief
the
system
act
around
of
them.
going to church is the discipline for me, not the doctrine or anything like that. The act of going to church and being with people and getting new ideas and things like that. It was bad for me during COVID before we started having our Zoom services, because I had nothing special to do on Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
And so it really was a great help for me over COVID to just be able to have some sense of being able to be in touch with the church. And when I go on vacation and don't go to church, it's like, oh, well, it's Sunday. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
I think we can really miss out on a lot when we just focus only on Christianity too. I think we miss out on a lot that we can learn and really enlarge our sense of spirituality and our idea of God.
Yeah.
When we're willing to listen to other traditions. And I think one of the great things that St. Francis did
very much
a few years ago was to focus the Sunday morning service on talking about different religious faiths, basically Hinduism and Buddhism and
And how do we continue to do that? I mean, I think that it has to be a choice that way. How do we make sure that we are not becoming complacent with whatever we've already discovered, but opening ourselves up continually too?
That's why that metaphor of the prism really just spoke to me.
Yeah.
the one light that shines upon us, seen through a prism, reveals so many other beautiful colors.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
And it is in investigating that you begin to see, or I begin to see, that yes, the prism shows me all of the questions I need to ask and understandings I need to have. And that taken each one alone cannot produce the brilliant, bright light that becomes the presence of God.
Mhm, mhm.
Well, and what Jim said about the Muslim idea that their emphasis is on the willfulness of the human spirit, and the Buddhist is on suffering. Those are elements that we don't look at that much in Christianity, but they can still have resonance, that we realize why those are important to those religions. That we do, I mean, willfulness is like original sin, is it not?
It is like original sin. And
And
for us to think that it's only us who need to be fixed and not the suffering around us,
yes,
I mean, that's essential in Buddhism, and I think essential in Christianity if we open ourselves up to that.
yeah,
To me, it's about searching out wisdom.
Uh-huh.
The wisdom, to me, it's all about each culture has their own wisdom. Native Americans have their
Mhm.
basic wisdom. So it's searching for the wisdom texts and the wisdom traditions, not a religion, but the wisdom that's imparted there.
Here's the really good news. There's work to be done,
You think?
right? We're not finished yet. The world has not achieved its perfection. The hard part is, of course, is that we are going to have to face some of the things that you've brought up. We're going to have to figure out how to maybe talk to a neighbor that is of a different mind than we are, how to truly listen to that neighbor rather than just say, nope, you're wrong. And it's really easy for all of us to take simpler routes rather than that universal route that Dr. Spong is calling us into. The question that he asks continually here is, what are we going to build? Right? We're going into a new phase of Christianity. What will it be, and what will you help to add to that phase? You don't get to finish it probably any more than what Bishop Spong did, but you get to draw part of the direction, don't you? Part of how you get to give some gift to this world. What will it be for you?
And somebody who's outside, like I've never been part of church in my life, really. I mean, I wasn't raised in a church, but to me, it's like, how is the church going to be relevant in the future? Even it's like we have, like, even at St. Francis, there's like, you do boom, 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 boom. You do this, this order every Sunday.
Yep, we get into our patterns, don't we?
This. And it's like, well, has anybody ever thought of mixing that up a little bit or doing something a little different? But then it's like, you better not even say that out loud. Because it's like, no, we do it this way, and this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we're going to do it in the future, and don't even mess with things.
Yeah. And that is the ongoing struggle right there, Judy, is whatever structure we've set up, we think it's eternal. Well, what if it's not? Whatever thought we have, we think it's universal, but what if it's not? Thank you for the time that we've had together. Thank you for your sharing.
Jim. This
Thank
has
you.
been
Thank you,
wonderful.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
It's been a great time. Take care, my friends.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.